Hi guys. Okay, so today's discussion board is about my use of technology to help assist my students inside of my classroom. So, living abroad and teaching students a second language has a lot of disadvantages. The biggest being that many of my students do not receive out of the classroom language practice, and that has a lot to do with like their parents or their grandparents don't speak English. They only speak Chinese, so they don't get a lot of practice outside of the classroom. So, to help with this, my previous school that I taught at, we would use an AI setup of learning for our students to complete throughout the week prior to them coming to their next lesson. So, it's either my kids once a week for an hour. They would have 2 hour lessons, 1 hour with me, 1 hour with a Chinese teacher. But prior to that, they needed to complete their AI homework that would usually take them most of the week to do, so that when they showed up that week for class, they had some acquired language of what the lesson's going to be about. And Robert Hughes actually described this as a flipped classroom, where students would complete some type of online learning outside of the classroom. And this would usually happen prior to students coming to class. So I've been working and living in China for a little over 2 years, and I currently started a new position. My old position was at a training center here in China. I'm now an international teacher at an international boarding school. So it's a little different with the curriculum setup. Instead of having a flipped classroom, it's more of like a blended learning model, where I can use different forms of technology to help enhance my lesson and describe the lesson. So I'm enhancing and describing the lesson or the lesson content with technology instead of having my students use an AI classroom setup prior to them coming to actual class. And with the blended learning, I can use different things to help my students. I can use videos. I tend to use a lot of different games that I've built where they have to practice the language, and then they can input the game answer, as well as them building different types of surveys, things like that, where it helps them use technology so they have a visual of how the language works, as well as what's the correct way to say something, besides them just sitting there and repeating the language back to me. And then I personally like a flipped classroom setup because I feel like it's easier for younger students to have prior knowledge of the language that's about to be taught to them, compared to just kind of throwing them new information, because it is a lot, especially when they don't really use the language a lot outside of their classroom setup. That is the only other difference between my old school and my new current position, is because it's an international school, they tend to speak more English at this school, and the parents tend to know more English. Whereas my old school, because it was a training center, a lot of these kids were coming in, they were getting training and lessons in English, but then their parents or their grandparents or whoever was living inside their home weren't able to speak English. So that's the only other difference between my old school and my current school. But I prefer a flipped classroom setup because with an AI, it's a little more interesting for the kids, whereas you have to put a little more effort and time into making sure you find proper games for your students in a blended learning method, especially the younger that they are. But yeah, that's how I use technology to help all of my students in a large range of language ability inside of my classroom, my old classroom and my current classroom.